Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing things a little differently. We're throwing the typical agenda completely out the window and dropping you straight into the chaotic, fragmented, and just utterly fascinating world of Joseph Heller's 1961 masterpiece. We're going to explore a novel that didn't just capture the total absurdity of war, but actually achieved something incredibly rare in literature. It birthed a concept with so much cultural weight and a phrase so universally understood that it was officially added to the dictionary to describe the maddening traps of modern bureaucracy. We're talking, of course, about Catch-22.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself completely stuck in a no-win situation? You know the feeling. Maybe you've run into that classic entry-level trap where you need experience to get a job, but, well, you absolutely need a job to get that experience. Or perhaps you've been tangled in an impossible bureaucratic loop where every single path forward is inexplicably blocked by the very rules that were meant to guide you in the first place. That feeling of complete, helpless frustration, that is exactly the phenomenon we're unpacking today, and we're tracing it right back to its literary roots.
Okay, let's dive into this. Long before we were tossing this phrase around the office or hearing it on the news, Catch-22 was actually an obscure military rule in Heller's novel. As you see here, it's defined as a problem for which the only solution is denied by a circumstance inherent in the problem or by a rule. Basically, it's a self-reinforcing circular logic loop that just eliminates any chance of escape. And you know what makes this logic loop so utterly terrifying to experience? It masks absolute madness as perfect, unbreakable reason. It literally traps you with a smile.
Section 1. The Ultimate Paradox.
To really grasp how this works, we've got to travel back to World War II, landing on the fictionalized island of Pianosa in the Mediterranean Sea. The men of the 256th U.S. Army Air Squadron are trapped here. But here's the crucial distinction. They aren't just trapped by the enemy, they're trapped by their own military regulations. And this brilliantly illustrates the core trap of the entire novel. So to get out of flying these highly dangerous, basically suicidal combat missions, a pilot can ask to be grounded on the basis of insanity. But there's a catch. Catch-22 specifies that a concern for one's own safety in the face of real, immediate danger is the process of a rational mind. So listen to this trap. If you ask to be grounded, well, you're sane, and therefore you must fly. But if you don't ask, you're crazy and don't have to fly. But since you didn't ask to be grounded, guess what? You're going to fly anyway. It's an inescapable, claustrophobic loop of pure, maddening logic.
Section 2. Yossarian's War.
Right in the dead center of this bureaucratic nightmare is our protagonist, Captain John Yossarian. Yossarian is a B-25 bombardier who has come to a terrifying realization. The enemy is anybody who's going to get you killed, no matter which side of the trenches they're on. In fact, Yossarian is way more terrified of his own ambitious commanders than he is of the German anti-aircraft gunners. Because he realizes the whole system is out to get him, his sole motivation becomes incredibly simple: live forever or die in the attempt. He resorts to some incredibly fast-paced, darkly comedic stratagems to avoid combat. For instance, he constantly checks into the hospital with this mysterious pain in his liver that falls just short of being jaundice. Why just short? Well, because if it were actual jaundice, they'd cure him and send him right back to the front. An undiagnosed ache keeps him safe in a bed. He goes as far as secretly moving the bomb line on the squadron's map during the Great Big Siege of Bologna just to delay a terrifying mission, tricking his commanders into thinking they already captured the city. He even constantly plots an emergency heading into neutral Switzerland during flights, dreaming of being interned in luxury for the rest of the war instead of fighting.
But here's the kicker. No matter what he does, no matter how clever his schemes are, he just can't escape the machine. By the end of the novel, Yossarian flies an astonishing 71 missions. Why? Because his commander, Colonel Cathcart, desperately wants to be promoted to general. For Cathcart, the lives of his men aren't human lives at all. They're merely a bureaucratic metric he can use to earn a shiny new star on his collar. So Cathcart constantly, retroactively raises the required number of combat missions needed to complete a tour of duty. For the soldiers on the ground, the finish line is permanently moving, just out of reach.
Which brings us to Section 3. Bureaucracy and Black Humor.
To capture this specific brand of institutional madness, Joseph Heller didn't just write your standard run-of-the-mill war story. He deliberately utilized surrealism, piercing satire, and deep, deep black humor to expose the rot of the military-industrial complex. Now, what's really fascinating about this timeline is how Heller structures the narrative to reinforce that feeling of madness. The book doesn't read smoothly from point A to point B. It's deeply fragmented. Events are told, abandoned, and then retold from completely different perspectives entirely out of sequence. And this isn't just Heller showing off his literary chops, right? This nonlinear structure perfectly mirrors the psychological fragmentation and severe disorientation of the soldiers themselves. As a reader, you're made to feel just as confused, overwhelmed, and trapped in circular conversations as the troops on the ground. The chaos of the narrative is literally the chaos of the battlefield.
And man, absolutely nothing captures this absurd, terrifying chaos quite like the character Milo Minderbinder, the squadron's mess officer. Milo manages to turn this deadly war into a booming, completely amoral capitalist enterprise. In one of the most unbelievable and darkly funny sequences in the whole book, he literally employs German planes to bomb his own American encampment. Why? Simply because the military paid him to do it. The American military establishment accepts this blatant treason because Milo can point to a neat ledger showing that the math works out and a profit was turned. His famous slogan, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for the country," is actually a direct, satirical jab at a real 1953 quote from the CEO of General Motors. It brilliantly and terrifyingly highlights how the machinery of war generates unspeakable violence simply as another legitimate means to profit.
Now let's turn to Section 4, the tragedy of Snowding. But, here is where the farce drops away. The humor fades. In the final sections of the book, the reality of war violently asserts itself, shifting the story from an energetic, dizzying satire to a brutal, sobering tragedy. This pivot centers on a horrifying, existential realization for Yossarian. During a chaotic, blood-soaked bombing run over Avignon, he comes face to face with the absolute fragility of the human body. He realizes, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that man was simply matter. Drop him out a window and he falls. Bury him and he rots like garbage.
This shattering realization happens during the devastating death of a young radio gunner named Snowden. Snowden's plane is hit hard by anti-aircraft flak. In the freezing, chaotic fuselage, Yossarian tries desperately to save him, carefully treating a visible leg wound with white bandages and sulfanilamide powder, desperately trying to reassure the boy. But Snowden just keeps repeating two words, "I'm cold." It's only when Yossarian opens Snowden's heavy flak suit that he discovers the true, fatal wound hidden underneath and helplessly witnesses the young man's internal organs spill out onto the floor. It is a haunting, deeply traumatic sequence that serves as the emotional core of the entire book.
So, the crucial point here is that this tragedy isn't just about one man's death in the sky. It violently highlights the overarching, dehumanizing effects of a war, and honestly, a society that values bureaucratic protocol entirely over basic human compassion. We see the total psychological breakdown of the soldiers. We watch their moral boundaries crumble. Because, think about it, when an institution completely abandons you and treats your life as a mere statistic, basic animal survival becomes the only morality you have left. Ultimately, it leads to a terrifying desensitization to the pain and death surrounding them every single day.
And finally, Section 5, an enduring legacy. Emerging from that profound trauma, Yossarian has to make a choice. And the choice he ultimately makes, alongside Heller's incredible narrative style, cemented this story's place in history, leaving a massive cultural footprint. The themes of Catch-22 were so potent and universal that Heller actually revisited them decades later in a 1994 sequel called Closing Time. But notice how the dread beautifully, yet tragically evolves. We transition from the visceral, immediate fear of violent death in World War II combat to a 68-year-old Yossarian living in 1990s New York. Now he's grappling with the invisible enemies of modern life, the existential terror of aging, the looming threat of cancer, and the sinister, secretive actions of a modern military-industrial complex that's quietly building underground survival bunkers for the societal elite. The Catch-22 didn't disappear. The trap simply changed its shape. And the resonance of that original trap was absolutely astounding. Since its publication, Catch-22 has sold well over 10 million copies. Interestingly, it wasn't a runaway blockbuster on day one, but it quickly gained momentum and became a massive cult favorite, largely because its deep anti-war and anti-establishment sentiments perfectly mirrored the zeitgeist of the 1960s. For the youth of that era, who were facing the Vietnam War, the book was a revelation. They felt they were being drafted by an unfeeling, bureaucratic government into a meat-grinder conflict with constantly shifting, illogical justifications. They looked at Yossarian's plight and saw their own lives perfectly reflected on the page. At the very end of the novel, Yossarian makes a radical, definitive choice. Inspired by his eccentric tent mate Orr, who miraculously managed to row a tiny life raft all the way to neutral Sweden, Yossarian decides to desert the military. But importantly, he doesn't view it as running away. He proudly declares that he is running to his responsibilities. He outright refuses to be complicit in a mad, destructive system for even one more day. So I leave you with this to ponder. When you're faced with the absurd, inescapable bureaucratic traps in your own life, do you play along, or do you find your own Sweden? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.